disastrous.
There's multiple mistakes that people make on this front. One is thinking it's their fault if they feel an emotional toll or emotional burnout from working in this sector. And that's insane. What we ask you to do to be good at your job is have empathy. And by having empathy, you have to be a human in this. You have to open yourself up to it not just being your work life. It's going to be part of your life. If you're doing well at your job, you're probably going to be exposed to this. You're not broken. You can come back from this. You just might need a rest or you might need some help.
This is Elizabeth McNaughton. Welcome to Disrupting Disasters, conversations with disaster experts about how we can do disasters differently. Oh, this chat's a goodie. It's with Dr. Kate Brady, and she is such a force. Kate has a PhD in public health with a focus on disaster recovery. She is the National Recovery Advisor for Australian Red Cross and Senior Research Fellow at the University of New South Wales. Kate and I have known each other for over a decade, and we do a lot of things together, and we fall into these two roles where I'm the optimist and she's the pragmatist. And I find to be the optimist with such a brilliant, smart pragmatist really pushes me. That's one of the things I love about Kate. She pushes me and helps me grow and to be better. And we all need friends like that. We had such a good chat. Let's get into it. We should really start at the very beginning, I thought. What are your memories of when we first met, Kate?
It was not long after the Canterbury earthquakes in 2011. And I was working for Australian Red Cross, and we were a couple of years into our long-term recovery program following the 2009 Victorian Black Saturday fires. And we were kickstarting our recovery program for the 2011 flood and fire season, which is a very big season in Australia. You asked me to come over to New Zealand. And I think it's because you were just recruiting the first members for your recovery team in Christchurch. We had hotel bookings, but as everyone would very correctly assume, there was a massive accommodation shortage in Christchurch at the time. We all had separate hotel rooms booked. There was Rochelle, who it was her first day, and Andrew, who had been my boss for a couple of years and you had only just met, and me and you, who had known each other for about 2 weeks at the time or something like that. And we walked into this hotel room. It wasn't separate hotel rooms. We thought it was a little apartment that had 3 bedrooms. And you went very, very pale very quickly and were like, I can't ask my new employee to sleep in the same room with me on her first night. I can't do that. And I was like, don't worry, you and I are going to share a bedroom. There were 2 beds in there. It's not a problem. It's a disaster. We are all adaptive. Do you snore? I don't think I snore. And it was fine. And then the second day, we drive back to the hotel room, going to like 100 different appointments back to back to these different meetings. And there's 6 dudes sitting on a couch in high vis, drinking beer, watching football. And they look at me and they're like, hello. And I look at them and I say something that involves some swearing. And they were like, why are you in our room? And I was like, why are you in my room? And it turns out that the lady who ran the hotel had moved us out without telling us into another room that had 1 bed in it. And so I walked out to the car and I was like, snuggle up, McNaughton, it's happening. And so for the next couple of nights, we cuddled in together literally overnight. And there's a photo of us floating around somewhere where I am wearing a New Zealand Red Cross polar fleece and she's wearing an Australian Red Cross polar fleece. They're both really ugly jackets and we're in bed together. And it was just, all right, I guess we're going to have to be friends now. We may not see each other for days or weeks or months, but I know I can always share a bed and she likes the left side.
And when you find your disaster cuddle buddy, it's just the best too.
Definitely put our relationship on hyperdrive, but it was going to happen anyway because there were so few women our age that were in the type of roles that we were in. There were women in these roles, but they tended to be older and more experienced than us. And there were loads and loads of men. And there were very few women at our age and stage that were doing it. So we were always going to be hanging out anyway, I think.
I think so too.
I was trying to count how many times I came over in those first couple of years, but it was a lot. It was probably every 6 to 8 weeks I was coming over.
It was. And we started implementing a lot of your work, which gave me a steady kind of grounded feeling that we were doing something that had proven impact. I think in these kind of positions, in these large events, to have somebody to walk alongside you, to guide you, to validate, to just help out, to tell you to pull your head in and look after yourself. You're good at that one. Was so powerful. And I'm feeling all my grateful feelings again right now. It was the best. And then we've been doing this gig for ages now. Sometimes I get really frustrated, start to think, are we really learning anything from this? And you put it really well. Some of the things we're doing are batshit crazy.
Yes.
We're going to look back and go, why were we doing it like that? So, yeah, what are you seeing that invokes that batshit crazy response?
I think for me, the big one with disasters at the moment is that we treat them episodically. We have all this data, we have all this experience, we are watching it unfold before our eyes, but we still treat them as separate events. We still treat in disaster recovery anyway, not so much in response, but we treat the workforce as being a new workforce each time. We treat our funding pool separately. We treat the incidents as being separate. And that to me is batshit crazy that we're still doing that. And I think that will change. I think disaster events will force us into it. We have known for 40 years, more than 40 years, that they're going to be coming more frequently, more severely. They're going to overlap and compound each other. We're just not going to be able to get away from it. And so we're going to adapt that way.
Yeah, you're so right. Been working with communities and have had 9 weather events. And this idea of transitioning in and exiting out of recovery, it's permacrisis. So.
Yeah, and I think also that idea of being able, you're talking about 9 weather events, this idea that we separate out different disaster events based on the hazard, it's weird to me. I understand it from a combat agency perspective. You need a firefighter for one and you need flood experts for another. I get that. But from a community member's perspective, whether you're going through COVID, whether you're going through a massive industrial shutdown, whether you have a major road trauma that takes out a number of people in your community, whether you are having a fire, flood, cyclone, or all of them back to back, the hazard event isn't really the point. It's what comes after.
I totally agree. And I was chatting to Dr. David Lalimo on an episode of this podcast, and he had a question for you. What do you see the role of imagination for this kind of new state that we're living in? Because there is the shift that's needed from how we've done things in the past to how we do things going forward.
I have 2 views on this, and I think they contradict each other. One is that it's super important because you can't know what you can't know. So if you are only playing with lived experience and stuff that you have previous data for or people have witnessed and can describe, you're obviously going to shoot yourself in the foot. If we can't engage our imagination, we're going to be stuck in the same processes. And I do understand that. Except that I would probably leave that conversation to you because you tend to cling to the optimistic side of things and love a bit of whimsy. So I'll present the other side to it. And that is, imagination is awesome, but if we use our previous experiences of using imagination, we'll see that we very rarely use it. We hold up these really big, shiny stand-up examples of, yeah, but if we didn't have imagination, we wouldn't have vaccinations and we wouldn't have the technology we have now. And it took one person who had this idea. That is absolutely true, but we see the one-off winners when we talk about that. And actually, there's billions of dead reports sitting around of people where they've been asked to have a workshop to use their imagination. So that to me doesn't say that imagination isn't useful or important. It says to me it's not the mode that most people operate in. And if you want to engage most people, you need to use the mode that they operate in, even if you don't like it. I'm a really big fan of asset-based community development, basically because it's so incredibly simple. It's don't create something new and force people to use it. Use what they use. Don't put the burden on someone to have to use what you want them to use. Use what they use, whether that is means of communication, whether that's decision-making processes, whether that's governance structures, whatever it is. And sometimes I think we forget to treat our colleagues and the institutions around us as communities. And if we treat them as communities and use asset-based community development with our colleagues and with our industries and with our organizations, I totally get it. It's a heaps less sexy, less exciting pace to work at and less fun route. But sometimes we need to push things incrementally. Most disasters are very small scale, managed locally. Most disasters don't get additional support and additional funding. But the big ones, those really big, game-changing, paradigm-shifting ones, that's where I think we need to be able to latch onto those with the imagination process and push it, because whether or not people liked it, the rules changed.
Large events provide this opportunity like nothing else. It's development on speed, really. I've been hanging out recently with a lot of entrepreneurs, and the mindset feels so different from our kind of traditional emergency management sector. I've just noticed in them the fixation on solving a problem, listening to your customer to solve that problem, stepping into the space that is without boundaries and really working out what is possible and holding that tight. But at the same time, you've got these hideous constraints like no cash flow and no time and all of these sorts of things. And watching that mindset and that kind of enthusiasm that's almost...
I would challenge you on that. The listeners may not know this, but what you're trying to do is, in your very gentle and very optimistic way, is to convince me to take back everything I just said. And they don't know this yet, but this is what happens when you work with someone for this long. He agrees with you and then presents the exact opposite reasoning to you and then tries to coax you over to her side. And I'm okay with it. I want to agree with you. But you think of any entrepreneurial idea that has got to scale, it has gone to bureaucracy. That's what scale is. It is a heaps more fun environment to play in. Being able to let our imaginations run wild with all the different possibilities is important, and it's crucial for us to stay optimistic. But that's not where we live most of the time. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be aspirational. I'm not saying we shouldn't try and move to these things. But there is a pragmatic reality of where we're living. And we have to be able to chip away at that as well.
Yeah, it's an and, right? There are aspects where we need to have some new mechanisms, new ways of going faster.
Definitely. And we need to keep doors open so these people can come in instead of being a closed shop. Definitely.
Yeah. And I see that entrepreneurs working in so many ways in other sectors that could be beneficial to ours. But I also see what you're saying, right? There are only a certain number of opportunities or space for a Ferrari when actually the motorway is jammed with Corollas. So we all need to be on the road. My point is we just don't have enough of this kind of thinking or spirit or the tools that are used to do this. So I just think perhaps we could upskill a little bit to create something different, because we need a fundamental shift in how we think and how we do things. And yes, we have been in this process of incremental change, but it doesn't feel like our world is an incremental change space at the moment.
I completely agree with you. It probably is a both and thing. I was talking to a friend the other day and they were talking about the politics of Obama versus Biden, right? And around how, whether or not he really was in his presidency, we see Obama as standing in for this entrepreneurial, hopeful change mindset, this idea of moving things fast, big paradigm shifts, the feeling of that presidency versus the feeling of the Biden administration. And her point is that Joe Biden is effectively a Trojan horse. He's an 80-something-year-old white Catholic who knows the ins and outs of every bit of a broken but existing system. And he's able to make change happen within that existing system by inviting people in to make small but important changes that have flow-on effects that can then be taken up more easily because something in a system changed. And it's heaps less interesting. Like it's heaps less inspirational. It's like loads more boring to think about change in that way. And her argument was, if you looked at it from efficacy of change, everyone would go, Obama was Obama. And actually, from a legislation perspective, maybe it's Biden. And no one wants to think about Biden like that versus Obama, right?
How do you manage, because it's years now that we're working on this stuff, how do you manage the emotional toll of that? Or how have the years worn on you, do you reckon?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on that a lot at the moment. It's my 15th year anniversary of disaster, like working in disaster land.
I'm so glad you're still with us.
So I have been thinking a lot about this because this is a sector that really does churn and burn a lot of people, and longevity in it is rare. And in recovery anyway, response I think is more common because you have a professional pathway through, and in recovery you don't really have a professional pathway through. You can't be a little girl and be like, when I grow up, I want to be a disaster recovery manager. But you can be like, I want to be a firefighter. Or I think I've pulled up okay. But I've been sort of thinking about this a lot lately. Next week, I am going to a group therapy session for people who have been exposed to multiple traumas over extended periods of time. I'm very much looking forward to that. When you and I met, one of the things that you wanted me to impress upon your new team was the importance of self-care. And I know all the arguments against self-care, as in self-care being it puts the burden on the individual rather than the systems creating the problems. I do understand why it can be viewed as being an ugly term. But that was something that I was incredibly fierce on with my teams. And I didn't always get it right, but it was something that we always talked about and was a very open discussion within the Australian Red Cross Emergency Services team. And that was led by people other than me. There are lots of people, particularly Andrew Coughlin and John Richardson, who talked really openly about how they had struggled at different times and how they managed that. But I really do believe that you definitely have to be able to take care of yourself, to know what you look like when you're not going well. If you don't have the awareness of when things aren't going that well for you, it will get really bad before you notice it if you don't know what those incremental slips look like for you. And I think there's this really false dichotomy that's presented. Either you've coped very well through it or you haven't coped at all. And I think that's nonsense. Like, we all have good patches. We all have bad patches. We all are coping better at some times than other times. And that's just life. That's not even just this work. That's just life. If you think you're going to get through this career flawlessly and like always on top of your game, it's going to be very sad for you when it all falls apart. And when I'm running training or talking to people in professional supervision and things, I use the analogy a lot. And this is a crude analogy and some people feel uncomfortable with it, but I use the analogy of the urinary tract infection. That if you think about burnout and vicarious trauma as being like having a urinary tract infection, you can get your head around it a lot easier. One, it's not your fault. Some people are more prone to them than others. Some activities are more inclined to give us one than others. But the first time you get one will probably be the worst time you get one because you don't know what is happening and you let it get bad, but you don't ask for help because it's very embarrassing. You finally go and get help because the pain is worse than the embarrassment of getting help for the pain. You find out actually there's a lot of things that you can do both preventatively or if it's happened that will treat it really quite effectively. And then you're like, okay, the next time I feel the beginning of this, I'm going to jump onto it because I know how awful it is when I don't jump onto it. And I think burnout and vicarious trauma is a bit like that in this sector. It doesn't feel good. It's very painful. So I do what I can to avoid them. And then if I see the signs of it, I treat them. And as I say, sometimes in my career, I've done better at that. And other times I've done worse at that. But there's multiple mistakes that people make on this front. One is thinking it's their fault if they feel an emotional toll or emotional burnout from working in this sector. And that's insane. What we ask you to do to be good at your job is have empathy. And by having empathy, you have to be a human in this. You have to open yourself up to it not just being your work life. It's going to be part of your life. If you're doing well at your job, you're probably going to be exposed to this. It's not your fault. And the second thing is thinking that once it's happened, that you're broken. You're not broken. You can walk away from it because you don't want to do it anymore, because you don't like this feeling. That's completely fine. You're allowed to do that. But I think so many people don't talk to their colleagues about it because they're so worried that they'll be seen as being broken and therefore useless in this now. And that's just not true. You speak to any person who is working in a senior role or has been around for a long time, they will tell you, period, that they've had very bad experiences or they've really struggled in this. And sometimes they haven't been able to pull up as fast as they'd like to, or they haven't been able to access the support that they should have earlier on, whatever, for 1,000 different reasons. It doesn't mean you're broken. You can come back from this. You just might need a rest or you might need some help.
Yeah. The tough things are part of this work. All get thrown under the bus somehow at some point. And we can have these tough times community facing, or if I think back, I've had a mayor throw me under the bus with the Prime Minister. Things happen. It's part of what we do. What I find is people can take it so personally, like it's about their competence or it's a personal attack on their integrity, and it feels that way, absolutely. But sadly, I see that retribution is a part of disaster management. We just don't talk about the fifth R.
Don't you think that it's interesting that you think of trauma or emotional exposure in this work and you go straight to the political systems? And I don't mean like big P politics, small P politics, like organizational or interpersonal things.
That's the disaster after the disaster.
For me, the disaster is the administration systems of business as usual not being fit for purpose. So governance purposes, admin systems not being fit for purpose. But almost everybody I know that works in this for a really long time is completely fine with working with really distressed people and really distressed communities. And it just says something about how we talk about this work, doesn't it? We all have our different trigger points of what is most upsetting to us. And I used to be flagged all the time in different systems for being someone who's been exposed to a lot of trauma and therefore is a risk for different mental health or health-related issues. And I would always be like, the finance system is the thing that kills me. It is not going out to talk to people who are upset for really reasonable reasons. It is this stuff that happens. But that said, and I think you and I would usually end the conversation there, right? I very artfully dodged your how has this affected you? And I talked about vicarious trauma and burnout, gave you an analogy that made you giggle. And then we both talk about, no, actually what people don't understand is the real thing is the politics or the administration. But actually we're both dodging it, aren't we? It has taken a toll being exposed to this many disasters and this many people under distress, even if I feel like I've coped with it for the most part. But what I think it has done is very slowly and quietly changed my worldview. It hasn't been a big moment, this big shift that I've gone, oh, look at that. I used to think this and now I think this. Doing a lot of deep reflection over the last couple of months has made me think the worldview I have about things that can go wrong with very little notice is not normal. I am surprised it has not happened to me and my family and my loved ones for the most part. I assume that my children will have to deal with me dying suddenly and deal with an aftermath of something. I talk to my partner as if it's an absolute no-brainer about what we will do when our house is destroyed and when we are unemployed as a result of it and stuff. And I think because I live almost in an echo chamber of other people who are like, yeah, that's just sensible. Of course you'd think about that. It's only when you talk to people who don't do this sort of work who go, no, that's not normal. It's not normal to have a moment each time you kiss your kids goodbye when they go to preschool or school to wonder if today is the day that I'm going to die and they're going to have to figure this out without me. Or even worse, thinking about, is something going to happen to them? It's not a paralyzing thing for me. It's not something that stops me from going on about my day. It's not something that stops me from letting my kid go and have normal kid experiences or anything like that. But I don't think it's normal to have those thoughts. And I think a lot of my colleagues have those thoughts, and we've all normalized it for each other.
I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it. And
you're writing a book for your son that you're talking about presenting to him and going through with him. But actually, I'd bet a bit of money that it's probably because I'm going to die very suddenly and I want him to have something that helps him.
100%. And writing it helps me. And I assume he will need it.
Yeah, and that's not normal, right? It's one of the things about becoming a parent is everyone all of a sudden has to face their own mortality. But the way that many people who work in this sector think about it as being a given is not normal.
I hadn't thought of that like that before. I'm having a moment because you're right. I think too, each of these events in different ways, I feel a part of growing me into who I am. They shape not only my worldview, but how I am in the world.
It also took something from you as well, each of those events by growing you up.
Yeah. And sometimes I'm like, I don't want another growth opportunity. Seriously? Another growth opportunity has just come along. Serious?
Yeah.
But definitely I have those moments. But later, in hindsight, I look back and think I learned something about myself. I had to grow into that situation.
Yeah.
I'm grateful for that on the whole, but you're right. It's a toll. It's not for free. You pay the ticket price, you know?
Yeah, there's an Australian journalist, her name's Lee Sales, she's very well known over here. She wrote this book called Any Ordinary Day, and it was a way of reckoning with something very big and traumatic that happened in her life. She had a very scary near-death experience, and then she went and interviewed a whole bunch of other people that something really catastrophic had happened in their life. And she talked about this idea of, yeah, I think it's probably made me a better person, but I would much prefer to be a worse person and have not gone through it. That sort of brings you to another thing that I have been really reconciling with the last year or so. And one of the things that this work has made me very good at is accepting that something bad has happened and then going, okay, but then what needs to happen? Not dwelling on the how did it happen? Why did it happen? Why to this group of people? I don't probably dwell as much as a lot of people do on that. I go, okay, register what has happened and now what needs to happen as a result of that. That has definitely infiltrated my home life and my personal life, which a lot of the time is a very positive adaptive behavior. So, I got hit by a car 10 years ago in 4 days, I think. I got hit by a car when I was a pedestrian. I had to have my hand reconstructed, and it was a very long and painful process and still very much affects every day for me. It never occurred to me to think, oh, I'm so angry that I got hit by the car, or why didn't the person stop? Why wasn't the light set up better? Or there should have been a mirror there so the car could see. None of that ever even occurred to me. I went straight on to what does this mean and what are the impacts of this and what are the consequences and how do I manage this? Other people in my life got very angry for me. And I was almost observing them going, why are you wasting your energy there? It already happened. So it's a very adaptive behavior in some ways. But I have been talking to a psychologist recently about this process. And she's like, it's kind of funny because for most people, I need to get them past the living in the emotional experience of the thing and getting them to move into the adaptive behaviors and going, what do I do now? You almost so fast bypass the emotional experience of it that actually that's something you need to learn how to do. You need to learn how to sit there and be sad or be angry or be frustrated or be whatever, have that sense of injustice and then adapt to it. So there have been times in my life where it has been hugely adaptive and hugely helpful and I think has benefited me a great deal. And if you couldn't do that, it would be very hard to continue to do this sort of work. But it probably has made me a bit weird in that I don't sit with the emotional experience of the big thing or even the small thing like other people do.
Yeah. I feel sometimes we are living Stoic philosophy. You know, that memento mori. It's like we get that lesson pushed in our face day after day.
Yeah, maybe.
Gratitude for being alive. Each time it's my birthday, I'm like so happy it's my birthday. I think of all the done ways I could have died that year and I didn't. And I get a whole nother year. And I feel so excited about that. I think that is the most glorious thing. And I don't just have a birthday, I make it a birthday month.
Yeah, no, I'm the same. When people complain about getting old, I say things like, yeah, but not everyone made it this far, right? Like we know lots of people who didn't make it this far. I am not as good as you, though, at embracing the celebration of it. I quite often think, oh, yeah, I should like really go out and do the thing.
I can help. We're going to have a hanger for your next birthday, mate. I look at you in awe at how you do the juggle and how you do all the things. And one of those awestruck moments for me was around your podcast and COVID. What people don't know is the behind the scenes of how you put that together.
I would say I think it is a good podcast because of all the people who came onto it and a very magnificent producer, Liz Keane. During the 2019-2020 fires in Australia, it was the first really large-scale disaster since I started working in emergency management where I wasn't at work. And that was because at the end of July 2019, I had 2 other children and then had twins that year. And so I watched a lot of that disaster unfold on the couch while I was feeding twins. And if you have twins, you'll know it is a never-ending thing. And so I was watching it all unfold on TV. And as we previously discussed, one of the things that I'm worst at and that I find most traumatic about my work is administration systems. And I've been thinking about this podcast for a long time, but I really just didn't have the energy, again, to push it through our internal systems to get the sign off by the 600,000 people that would need to sign off in it. And I sort of had this moment of, well, technically I'm not at work, so I can pitch this as a citizen, right? And so because you don't sleep when you have twins, I wrote a pitch to the ABC that night. I found a really excellent podcast episode by Monique Bowley. It's very good. And it talks through how to pitch a podcast. So I listened to that and then I wrote a pitch, expecting to never, ever hear back from them. And the next morning, I got a call saying, I got your pitch. It was really good. I want to talk about it. And I basically fell off my chair. It ended up becoming a partnership between ABC, Red Cross, and the University of Melbourne. And by the time it got up, we were really thick in the middle of COVID lockdowns. I live in Melbourne. We had 4 kids in the house, both of us, my partner and I, trying to work. So I had to record this podcast in mostly my wardrobe instead of in the ABC studios, and sometimes in the car and sometimes just under a blanket. I'd be sitting there with 1 or 2 kids on my hip, headphones on, them trying to grab the headphones or trying to grab the microphone. But the people on it and who are involved with it were just so generous in telling their stories and so unbelievably patient with me during that time.
And you made it happen.
None of it was pretty. I remember interviewing Dan Neely from Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office and him bursting out laughing as soon as I got on the screen because I was ensconced in a big pink blanket and I had a torch on so I could see, and my computer and the recording equipment, and he just could not stop laughing. And he was like, it's like you're in a uterus. That's how you look like right now. And that's the type of conditions we were recording these things.
Yeah. And it's terrific. And we'll put it in the notes and encourage everyone to listen to it. Actually, you're embarking on a new project right now.
It's pretty good.
So tell us, what excites you about it? What can we expect from it? How can we help?
The University of New South Wales was gifted a very generous philanthropic gift that allowed them to set up in a university called a chair. And a guy called Professor David Sanderson was appointed to that position. And what he's decided to do is set up a long-term initiative. It is funded for 40 years until 2064, which is very exciting. There's not like mountains and mountains of cash that we're swimming in, but what it does provide is very generously provides this incredible stability for us that no one has. And we really recognize that privilege. The idea is setting up a long-term initiative that basically uses research, advocacy, and education to change the narrative around what happens to people after a disaster, really changing that narrative from top-down approaches to community-centered and community-led approaches. We are a couple of months in and we're launching in September, but it's going to have some traditional research elements, some non-traditional, but then a lot of focus on advocacy and education, making sure things are really accessible. And what this sort of funding allows us to do in a research institution is move away from those very strict and traditional academic metrics that you have to provide, like journal publications, and to be like, what is it that we can actually be useful for both disaster affected communities, but also the people who serve them.
This is a golden project and a game changer potentially.
One of the things that I've been doing is trying to interview people who have inherited long-term centres that have lasted to 40, 50, 60 years, and being able to talk to them about what do they wish the people who had set them up, what do they wish had been done differently. And so those conversations have been really interesting. It messes with your head a bit, thinking about something that is going to outlast you, at least professionally, if not in life, talking about how the legal landscape will be entirely different in 40 years' time. Institutional setups, technology will be incredibly different. Of course, disasters will be different. You create something now that you think will be able to exist in perpetuity or will be able to be adapted. And of course, the vision, the goals will have to change over time. I'm really comfortable thinking about things like that. But they're like, yeah, but how are you tracking the work that you've done now, and how are you going to be able to transport that to the next technology platform? Because that didn't happen for our institution and we're missing 25 years worth of records, and that becomes a real problem for us. I've not started a job in this sector in the last 15 years, not in the middle of a disaster, where the mode is very much get it going. It's not going to be perfect. Get on with it and then figure it out as you go. It is an entirely different way of working. Okay, the thing that I'm about to do is going to have implications for the next 4 decades. So how do I stop and think about this? If I did it full time, I'd probably go a little bit mad, which is why I've got to stay in disaster recovery practice land as well. I've got to straddle the two divides, but it's a very exciting project to be a part of.
I think that is such a powerful way of thinking. Imagine if in general we thought, okay, what are the implications of what I'm doing now for the next 40 years or the next 100 years? And if we used that question as a starting point for our work, how it would be different. I love that. If you could, like this, change one thing in how we do disasters, what would it be for you?
It's a big question, isn't it? If I think about practically, what I would really like is for anyone who's working in post-disaster settings, and it doesn't matter at what level, at neighborhood level, regional, national, to all have access to some information and training before they start the roles. And it sounds so simple and so basic, but they don't get that information, and it becomes really hard for the people who are doing the work, who are trying to serve the communities who are affected, and they accidentally make very preventable mistakes, not because they're not trying their absolute guts out. They are trying so hard. I could count on one hand the number of people that I've thought are working with poor intention in this sector. It's not that. It's that they don't get the support that they need to do the job that they're doing. They usually have amazing backgrounds, are really skilled, fantastic people who have just never had to do it in a post-disaster setting. And being able to give those people some support would mean that the people they're serving experience the aftermath of disasters quite differently. Most people cope really well with an earthquake, a fire, a flood, a cyclone. It's scary, it's awful, but they cope quite well. Most people don't cope with the stuff that comes after it as well. And I think that's really reasonable, because the stuff that comes after is designed by humans and there's systems issues. They're not doing it on purpose. They're doing it because they haven't had experience in it or training in it, or are being forced to work at a pace that doesn't allow them the time to reflect. And so I would really like support for those people so that they can support the people they're trying to support better.
That's so on point with our mission at Disastrous. That's so on point with the work that you're doing, and that feels achievable. I love that one.
Hopefully it's achievable. It feels like a small goal, but I think people from all walks of life come into this in all different types of roles, in paid and unpaid capacities. They're given so little support irrespective of these roles.
Yeah, and it's overwhelming and it's huge, and there's this intense pressure and these intense needs, and it's often public. They just don't know what they don't know because it's their first experience of it. And how could they?
And hired and working their absolute guts out and throwing everything they've got at it.
Yeah. And it's no, we need more, we need it faster.
We need it differently, but we need it slower, and we need it more considered, but we need it yesterday, and we need it done simply, even though it is incredibly complex. All things at all times.
Yeah. And you think, there are some things that would just absolutely change the game for these people if they had their hands on them. Yeah. We're so passionate about doing our bit to support that. Thinking about our next guest, what question would you like to leave them?
If we're moving into this realm of polycrisis or permacrisis or whatever word we want to use to describe it, is there a point to disaster management anymore if it's going to be so ubiquitous?
And it becomes everybody's job.
Yeah, I think, a health system that is geared up to be good in a disaster is much better than a health system that then has a disaster person who comes and helps respond to a disaster. But my fear is when something becomes everybody's problem, it becomes nobody's problem. As soon as it becomes everybody and nobody's issue, there is a group of winners and losers. People who experience systems discrimination. I know there's a lot of pushback against the term vulnerability as not being a strengths-based phrase, and I agree in a lot of ways, but also I think if we finish the sentence around vulnerability, vulnerable to what? We talk about vulnerability in disasters as a catch-all phrase, and then it gets assigned these demographic profiles, as opposed to saying vulnerable to not being able to evacuate, to losing your job, to not being able to complete your education, to having insecure housing. If we finish the sentence on that, then it would narrow down what the intervention points and the prevention points are and become less about a person being vulnerable and more about a person being denied equity in a system. And so if we take away people whose jobs it is to think and act specifically on these things, we take away that lens as well, I think. Disasters amplify what was before, and there are opportunities to shake things up and opportunities to change. But there is no getting away from the fact that if you were experiencing unstable access to housing before a disaster, you were going to experience that on hyperdrive after a disaster. So if we take away people who are focusing on disaster management, do we take away the opportunity to think about how disasters amplify these issues? Yeah, maybe that's what I should have said, keeps me awake at night. But that's what I would like the next person to be able to.
We'll find somebody who can solve that one, Kate. Okay. I love a good heartwarming story, and to look at the opportunities, the growth, the positive things that come from adversity. What is a heartwarming story that pops to mind from the disasters that you've worked in?
There probably are lots of different examples I could give, but the one that I'm thinking about is a Kiwi example. In the aftermath of the Canterbury earthquakes, one of the best post-disaster interventions I've ever seen was Gap Filler, the organisation that started up after the earthquakes in Canterbury that did placemaking throughout Christchurch. What it said to me was the understanding that people still need to live their lives after disasters. This idea of all of the things that we don't see as being very serious after disasters are actually the stuff of life, like the being able to go dancing with your friends, eat some takeaway food somewhere, watch a movie with people, go on a date. We need to understand if we're going to be able to support people to live lives that they really value living after disasters, we need to get this stuff if you can't go and have pleasure and leisure and positive routines, what's even the point of it? Remember the story about the first people who got married in the cardboard cathedral? Like, I burst into tears when I read that story. Just this idea of being able to reestablish beautiful rituals at a time where things feel so hard. If we don't get that, we don't get anything.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that disasters teach us is what is most important. What does life really mean? How do we really want to live our lives?
And it can seem flippant because people are like, I'm focused on food, water, shelter, and they're pretty important. And so, of course, they're important. They're the essentials, but they're not the stuff of life. They're not the meaning of it.
Yeah. As we're moving into a state of polycrisis or permacrisis, I think that is more important now than any other time. Oh, great point.
Delightful. I made Kate Brady say delightful on camera. No, I'm still smiling from it.
Kate, thank you so much for being with us today and for being such an incredible disaster cuddle buddy through many ups and downs, disasters. And I can't tell you how much your friendship and your expertise and your humor and all of the things that are you mean to me. And you just make doing this work better. So thank you so much for all of those things.
Right back at you on all of those.
Take care. Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening. A little reminder, if you enjoyed this podcast, please help us out and subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite platform. Even better, share it with someone in your network who might find it interesting. This podcast is produced by Disastrous. You can find out more at disastrous.co and join our newsletter for resources and content from this episode. Join us next time for another Disrupting Disasters.